from the Marine Management Organization. My role is really to beg, borrow, secure the evidence that MMO needs to make its delivery decisions. And this project stemmed from a need to provide further advice to fishermen in relation to non-lethal deterrent options for mitigation of negative seal-fishery interactions at sea. So a lot of what I do is across many different disciplines. I work in social, economic, and ecological sciences. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades now. So I'm delivering this talk on behalf of a very wide team of people, and it's through their hard work that I can share this with you. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the lead consultants, which were APD Mayer, led by Susanna Walmsley, who was a project lead, and her team, Barry Dees at NFFO, and Tegan Moore, Fisheries Consultant, who really did the delivery of this work. There are a few others who really were core to this, and Thomas Gutz is one of them at the St Andrews University. And not to give too much of the game away, also from the Genus Wave Acoustic Startle Device technology development. Staff from the Devon 7 IFCA were really essential in doing a lot of supporting a lot of the field work. So my thanks to them, and particularly to the Torbay inshore fishermen that allowed these and facilitated these trials with us. So many thanks. Funding was through the NFF. So I think duty done to all those, and we will have a look at where we're going with this talk. So this is an MMO project, MMO1131, looking at seal deterrent options to try and mitigate the negative interactions that we have anecdotally at first heard about between fishermen at sea and seals using the same space. So we'll go through an introduction to the project aims and its objectives, the program of work that was undertaken as part of this, and it was delivered in 3 phases of work: a literature and data review, a stakeholder engagement, and a survey work, and a set of field trials. So we'll look at project findings by phase. And then I'll just finish off by sharing a few of the perspectives of the different stakeholders involved in this. Some are more supportive of the direction than others, and it's interesting to see the challenges of working across multiple stakeholders. And obviously, as I said, the option for questions at the end, and I'll put up some useful links to the reports on which these are based. They're all published now. My contact details for the team should you wish to ask about any of this work, or indeed any of the rest of the work that the MMO does that is out there for discussion. So the driving aim of this work was to identify measures that MMO can advise fishing industry to use before the use of lethal seal controls, shooting the seals, in an attempt to reduce lethal force. It's one of those things that I think everybody recognizes is undesirable, although sometimes necessary with thanks to nets. This project had 3 objectives within that. It was to improve the understanding of seal depredation behavior. That's the stealing of catch, effectively, and how that is related to the magnitude of the seal populations, the locations of populations of seals and fishing, seasonality, gear types, and so on, that all have potential influence. It was to look at which options are already out there for managing this interaction, see whether there was evidence that any were effective and that we could already flag up existing options to the fishing industry, be they active deterrents like an acoustic deterrent, or be they changes to fishing behavior or tactics that they might use. So changing fishing locations, the depth at which nets are deployed, and so on. Ultimately, we found fairly limited evidence of existing viable options, and so we went on to understand the advantages and disadvantages of the current options and to go on to trial in collaboration with the fishing industry one of the options. And I think that collaborative trialing is important if we're going to get any sense of buy-in to management measures proposed. So, program of work, as I said, is based around 3 key documents, each of which are published separately in the project pages. It was a literature and data review, which explored the distribution of seals, their ecology, fisheries distribution overlaps, and then some of the evidence that's out there on what is driving interactions and what possible management measures are. And the outcome of that was a short list of measures that might be promising. The next step was a stakeholder engagement program, and that was looking primarily, what I'll report here is the survey, which was directed at the fishing industry specifically. So it's only one stakeholder group, but what we were trying to do there is to see what fishermen perceived as the problem, where the problem was, what they thought the solutions might be, and whether there was anything that matched between the literature review and the engagement that would suggest a way forward for what we might do about it. Engagement was also supported by a workshop, which was multi-stakeholders, so we had NGOs, regulators, technology developers, and so on present, and they helped inform from the outcomes of the survey and the literature review what we went on trial. And that brings us to the third piece, which is a program of deterrent trials. There's a lot in this work, and I'm only going to be able to briefly touch on some of the key points in each of these 3 reports. We are moving towards the outcomes and implementation stage, although that's still ongoing, so I'm not going to say too much about that, but there will still be bits and pieces touched on in the talk there. So, unlike in Scotland, we have a relatively limited number of seals. In fact, only about 12% of the UK population of grey seals occurs in England, and about 16% of common seals. So it is a different scale of distribution and usage. And what I've got here is just 2 representations of the distribution of seals. One in the left is the at-sea distribution with warm colours represent high use areas. And on the right, it's the location of haul-out spots with the circles representing the magnitude of the individual counts. These data are for grey seals. There is similar data in the reports for the common seal, for the harbour seals. And generally because as you'll see, we worked in the southwest, there are relatively few harbour seals. A lot of what I'll be talking about when I talk about seals generally is actually a reference to grey seals here. Because we haven't had any pictures of seals yet, I thought I'd put a couple of pictures in. The one most closely related to the study site that we ultimately end up with in the southwest is Mutton Cove in Collated in Cornwall. It's a cliff edge and stone beach haul-out. But there are a number of other seal haul-outs in England, particularly relevant. So if you're working from the northeast round, you have significant populations in the Farne Islands, in around Don and Nook in the Humber estuary, on the east coast, the Norfolk coast, particularly the North Norfolk coast and the Wash, around into the Thames and the outer Thames estuary. Outside of that, there's relatively few seal colonies and haul-outs in the English Channel until you get round to the Isles of Scilly and the southwest of Cornwall, where there are a few more. And in fact, there are about 280 grey seals that haul out in mainland Cornwall. One of the things that we were seeking to do with the literature review is to look at the distribution between seals and that of fishing effort as a means of identifying areas of potential conflict. The premise being that if both seals and fisheries are prevalent in the same area, targeting the same resource, you have an a priori expectation that there is the potential conflict. And this is indeed, seems to be the case. On the left-hand figure, you just have repeated the grey seal distribution at sea data that I showed previously. And on the right-hand image is the fishing value of landings around the UK coastline, particularly for netting vessels. And I've used economic value because it's a way to understand the importance of the fisheries without resorting to satellite tracking, which is not very common, and in fact it's not present on vessels smaller than 12 meters. So our understanding of the distribution of fishing effort in the inshore small vessels is problematic, whereas catch value is reported to IC's rectangle for all vessels. So it does give us an idea, in this case, of the netting distribution. Why have I focused on netting? Well, as we'll see later, netting is one of the fishing gears that seems to be most impacted by the interaction with seals. And so you can see here potentials for overlap in any of the major seal colonies up in the northeast, for example, particularly in the Thames and in the southwest, where you get a co-occurrence of higher seal activity and higher fishing netting activity. They can occur elsewhere. There's a lot of fisheries that have this potential conflict. Salmon in the northeast, monkfish in the south, pollock and hake on the Irish fisheries, elsewhere in the UK. So this is or has been a number of challenges to deal with. Jumping quite far through the literature review, the literature review explored quite a range of options that were out there. And this table just summarizes those that the literature and data review thought had the most promise. So if we were to look back at all the measures, these included things like electrification of nets, which is very difficult at sea. It included things like bagging and hanging feces, which has been used in the past as an olfactory deterrent, and things like that. But the ones that really had evidence that suggests that they might be viable are these here, and they split into two broad categories. They split into deterrent options, particularly acoustic deterrents in the white in the top half of the graph, and fishing tactics or behaviours that reduce the exposure of the catch to depredation. There were a range of other measures that might be classed as avoidance, things like moving fishing location, changing the season, and so on. But ultimately, these proved unlikely to be viable, given that fisheries tend to be targeting the same resource as the seals. So if the fish stock isn't elsewhere, the fishers can't move. So we have these two streams of perhaps trying to haul faster, produce shorter soaks, or fish at night. But they tend to have either limits on the catch, if you fish less fishing effort and shorter soaks, or safety considerations. So you can only haul so fast and be safe. Fishing at night is a problem for safety, especially for a lot of these small inshore vessels. that you'll see. Right. So ultimately, the review was coming down towards looking at acoustic deterrent devices. But the main concerns of the industry around there are costs and the infrastructure to support them. So technology development, electrical supply and vessels, and these sorts of logistics. But at least it's a logistical challenge, a technical challenge, not a safety one, which therefore might be able to be overcome. Moving into the engagement activity, this first slide gives a sense of the response demographics for the survey we ran. And I've made reference to a number of key points around the sizes of vessels and the gears used. And this in part really confirms the anecdotal evidence that was part of spinning up this project, in that those that responded to the survey, or those that were motivated to respond to the survey, were small vessels. So if you look at the figure on the right of the fishing areas, the pie charts and the sections in blue represent the under 10 meter vessels. So you can see that almost 3/4 of respondents, regardless of the area, were from the under 10 vessels. You can see the distribution is heavily skewed to the North Sea and the Southwest, a relatively small response from the Irish Sea. And if you look at the bottom left, you can see that responses were heavily dominated by fishermen reporting the use of static gears, lines, and hooks. And these small inshore vessels tend to be very flexible and very adaptable and change the gear depending on the season in which fishery they're targeting. So we see here that perhaps only 30% of respondents identified static fixed nets as their primary gear, but collectively, more than 60% of people were using nets in some capacity. So this really hammers home the fact that we have a particular intersection between static net fisheries, small inshore vessels, and the interaction seas. Exploring this a little further, so that previously was just the demographic of the respondents. This one is asking a specific question of reporting interactions with seals. And there was a range of interactions that they might have been reporting, including damage to nets, entanglement, and depredation. And we have a bit more detail in those in the report. But what's key here is that more than 80% of respondents were saying they frequently or occasionally had interactions with seals in static nets. And even in other métiers like hook and line, that still in total is taken together as frequently and occasionally still close to 80%. It also starts to separate out the fact that this doesn't appear to be a great issue for the towed gears, so auto trawls and beam trawls to a much lesser extent. In the bottom left is the distribution of those responses by axis rectangle where they were fishing. And you can see again that there are concentrations and interactions around the seal colonies, reinforcing the conclusions from the literature review. This particular data is for all gears combined, but because we have the heavy response rate from static nets, the all gears picture is relatively similar to the netting picture, and I can put that one in its stead. Part of the rationale for doing this work, and indeed the challenge that fishermen face, is we were asking these questions because there is a reported loss of catch. And we got at this, this proportion by asking them how many toes or hauls did they think were affected, what proportion of toes or hauls were affected, and another question which asked them what proportion of catch within a toe was affected. And when you put the two together, you can start to get an idea of the total catch affected. And that's what this figure shows across the three spatial areas. So approximately 30% loss of catch is reported by the fishermen in our survey. And this is slightly higher than what was captured in the literature review, which suggested between 10 and 20% of catches might be lost to depredation when taking a more empirical assessment approach. It's perhaps not surprising in that there is a vested interest in this from fishers' responses, and so perhaps there is an element of natural respondent bias here. What's particularly interesting is the very high levels in not specified area, but this was both a very small sample size and or somewhat, you know, if they're not sharing full information, you're a little unsure of the robustness of those investments. So taken together, 30% at the higher end, 10% from the literature at the lower end of catches lost. Either way, it is a significant loss of earnings to the fishing industry that we are working with quite a lot of variability in there. So the survey then asked questions around what would fishermen propose as a measure to address these interactions. The idea being, if our research and data collection came up with solutions that were somewhat consistent with what fishers proposed, we would have common ground on which to build. That certainly wasn't the case. There was a very large majority of fishermen reporting a desire for cull. That's not current policy, and it's not going to happen. So we removed that option. And while fishermen are concerned about the increases in seal numbers, in many cases we have increasing of static populations, unlike declines that have been observed in Scotland. They are often well below historic highs observed before systematic culls and increasing the stem and so on. So that wasn't going to be an option. The other one of note is the shooting. 9% of fishermen suggested shooting would be an option. This is in England already an option to them if they are required to do so in defence of their nets, and something we are trying to avoid as part of this scope of work. So this was another option that we chose not to take forward. That leaves us with a relatively small range of options, and one of particular note is a request for no rescue and release operations. Basically, let nature take its course was the phrase that appeared in pre-text. This is something that I think it's not a measure that we can implement in the sea trials, so it's not something that we've taken forward in this report. But what it does highlight is a very distinct perception difference between what fishermen perceive and some of the activities that MMO understands are happening through rescue and rehabilitation practices. And it may be that the action we take from this is around communication, building trust, clarity, and that kind of thing, rather than seeking no rescue release as a measure there. Which really leaves us with 2% saying they should avoid the area. That isn't really viable as a fishery option unless you can move elsewhere, which means you can't. And 2%, a really tiny minority even, supporting deterrent as the only viable conclusion. What this shows is the uphill struggled for buy-in that these sorts of management measures might have. Okay, so that's where it left us. We had acoustic deterrence emerging from the literature review. We had deterrence as the only viable suggestion from fishermen. And so that ultimately was the route we took. And this is a schematic of a device that we chose to trial. It's an acoustic startle device, which is the Genus Wave. It's developed by St Andrews University. So I'm sure many of you will have an interest in it. It has been trialed in aquaculture on static structures, but the key interest here is in deployment at sea. And that was really a developmental option, a development for this year. It's still in the prototype stage in that area. And what it has is it has a control unit and battery, both near surface on a surface buoy, with a suspended speaker underneath, emitting a deterrent noise. And in this case, we've chosen to deploy it free alongside the net, rather than, for example, suspending it below the vessel, which is one of the other options that we saw from the literature review. They're not market-ready devices yet, but they are getting there, and so I'll talk a little bit more about them now. So the Acoustic Startle Device by Genus Wave is based on a targeted acoustic startle technology developed by SNU and St Andrews University. And the current evidence suggests that it's among the most effective at deterring seals by triggering a startle reflex, rather than driving them away with a painful sound signal. This is more of an involuntary startle reflex. And unlike some devices, for example, designed to deter porpoises, where seals have less sensitivity, and they can get habituated to it and perhaps even see it as a dinner bell. The repeat elicitation of the reflex effect from the Genus Wave device seems to show sensitization, i.e. the response is greater. And a lot of the work underpinning this device has been done by Thomas Boots, who's acknowledged at the start. So thanks to him for sharing a lot of the information and being brought into this project as the trial progressed. The device operates at about 1 kilohertz, which is a lower frequency sound than many of the ADDs, the acoustic deterrents in the market, which are usually around 10 to 40 kilohertz. That means it's more geared to targeting pinniped hearing rather than your donkey seats, which have a higher frequency preference. And that means that because seals at the 1 kilohertz frequency are more sensitive to the sound than the toothed whales and dolphins, there's a certain avoidance of some of the side impacts that are associated with sound generation. You see particularly the possibility for negative impacts on other marine mammals. Because it also works on eliciting a startle reflex rather than inducing sort of a painful deterrence, the absolute sound levels can be slightly lower, and so again another benefit that seems to occur with this device. So the first part of work was a calibration and sound propagation piece, where the devices were trialed in Torbay, where the trials were conducted, and looking at the attenuation or the propagation and attenuation of the acoustic signal. So what you have in this figure is the received level with distance. And at source, the devices are producing around about 180, 181 decibels. And this progressively diminishes as sound is attenuated, ultimately to reaching somewhere around 140 decibels at about 500 meters. And at that stage, the device is largely ineffective or totally ineffective at eliciting the desired startle reflex. So we think we probably have around about 120 meters of protection from the device's radius. We looked really hard to try and find a fishery that we could undertake trials in. And I would like to have done trials in the areas of greater seal abundance, for example, in the Thames, but there just really wasn't either the logistical ability to do this, so depth limits, seasons when fish stocks were in, or the local support from fishers. But we're very thankful to find a fishery in Torbay, which is the inshore mackerel fishery, which is run through gill net fishing in relatively shallow water overnight. The rates were key, and thankful with two of the vessels, and were the two vessels that participated in the trials. What's nice is that these two vessels are very representative of the demographics of our survey respondents. So they're small inshore netters, and these are the guys that in the survey are reporting the greatest seal fishery interactions. The shallow deployment, the inshore nature, and the overnight soak also suggests that should seals be interested in the depredation, that they have the potential to do so. It's not outside their diving depth or swimming range or anything like that. So we deployed the ASD devices free. The control net had no device, and then because we had access to 3 devices, we deployed them in one of 2 forms: either a single device in the center of the net we were trying to protect, or 2 devices towards the end, each end of the net we were trying to protect. And for the single device, we rated the duty cycle, the amount of time that the device is emitting a signal, which at 2%, under 2%, is still brief compared to many other startle devices, acoustic devices. So it's got a really quick and short sound that triggers the startle response. So we had to factor this into the experimental design. So if you're like me, who can be statistically inept, that's my representation of myself trying to deal with statistics, you get help from elsewhere. And again, it was both groups, Susanna Walmsley and her team that dealt with a lot of the statistics. And they followed a generalized linear modeling approach using AIC to try and identify the most parsimonious models, minimizing the number of variables that really need to be included. We had a range of fixed and random variables, treatment being the particular one, the duty cycle, number of devices were in as covariates. And we also experienced quite a number of minor technical errors and some major technical challenges with the equipment where devices weren't operating optimally. Maybe they weren't emitting quite as loud as they should, quite as often as they should. So rather than chuck all suboptimal data, we put in an error variable which tried to quantify the working ability of the devices and deal with that. The response variables we were particularly interested in were the catch weight, so the total weight of fish caught in the net, the landings weight, so the weight of fish that went to market, which would exclude undersize and poor quality fish, and any depredation rates evidence. And just wrap up with towards the end of this, showing two of the particular effects. So in this figure, you have 36 trials that which we ultimately had successful after excluding invalid hauls and hauls with zero catch in both nets. It does happen in the rather stochastic nature of mackerel fisheries. And the cumulative weight running up the side. And ultimately, by the end of the 36 trials, there was an increase in total catch between the protected and unprotected net of about 74%. Quite a large confidence interval around those, between 5 and 189% increase, but a notable increase in fish catch. And in terms of catch, total catch alone, the only explanatory variable of relevance was treatment, the use or not of acoustic deterrents. We also have data on, for example, the landed catch, and that showed a similar picture where treatment and duty cycle as an interaction were significant, suggesting that as the amount of sound by the devices increases, the catch increases. It's about 110% increase in catch for each 1% increase in duty cycle. And we explored various aspects of this, including outliers that might explain this, but ultimately outliers were stochastic, and there was no real reason to exclude individual data points. So very promising outcome overall. The last set of results look at the effects of depredation rates. And this one's a little harder to explain because depredation was not explained by treatment, and instead it suggested that depredation rates were 3.4 times higher when devices were malfunctioning, and that occurred in both nets. So we've got a bit to disentangle there, whether there is some residual protection over 500 meters or quite where that stems from. But we were, with some reasonable confidence, able to identify depredation occurring because we look at some training and identification of seal bite marks and seal damage relative to, say, scavenging from crabs and whelks that are also in the area. So that brought us to the end of the trials, and it's where we start to reflect on what stakeholders' perspectives are on things. And we'll start with some of the sort of conservation type perspectives. They were very encouraged in collaboration, looking, for example, to support research in the interaction between seals and fisheries. They were keen to see a more systematic monitoring of bycatch and use of lethal force in seal fishery interactions, which isn't recorded in England. And that is a significant data challenge. It was one of the things that hampered, for example, a cost-benefit analysis of findings here. But there was some suggestion that perhaps this intervention using an acoustic deterrent was an intervention at the wrong stage of work, that maybe they would like to see both, for example, improvements in fish stock size, it's that win-win, looking at whether or not problems stem from ecotourism and hand feeding of seals, and to what extent it's a few individuals, rather than go to a deterrent option across that seals. Fishermen were reasonably positive, particularly those that participated in the trial, that were on the right track. perceived some of the positive effects. But for them, the challenges around the robustness of the devices and concerns over cost. These aren't necessarily going to be cheap devices to purchase, but there are other ways of doing that, higher purchase schemes and so on. More to be explored down the line. The developers, again, this was another positive from them. They're committed to developing a solution that works at sea, which is something that the evidence MMOs collected suggests is needed. Looking to get commercial availability late in 2020 or early 2021. Whether that happens or not, we shall see. And certainly the almost baptism of fire that the devices had in applying to an at-sea fishery really tested the robustness and allowed them to improve design of devices. So that brings me all the way through to inviting questions and to point out here that the evidence at management.org UK is a shared mailbox that the evidence team operates, and you are more than welcome to get in touch with us on any comments or concerns around the work, either here or elsewhere. And also, I suggest you might be interested in the three links here, which are links to our knowledge gaps, which might be collaboration opportunities, a projects register which publishes the work we do, including this project, and the last one is to the seal deterrent devices themselves. There are the three reports that seem to about 200 pages and 30-page summary, and a 2-page summary if you want to be. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you for your talk, and for all of those people who have submitted questions through the Q&A box that is below your screen. So if any of our attendees have any other questions that they haven't submitted already for me and Chris to work through, please just pop it in the Q&A box, and we are working through it chronologically. So we're just going to jump right into our first question, which is from David, who asks, when and how was the survey that you mentioned carried out? As some apparently northeast Scotland fishermen may not be aware, because obviously it's of interest to them, particularly with the Scottish mackerel handline fishery.
Yeah. So it was carried out approximately a year ago now. It was primarily directed at English fishermen, mainly because MMO doesn't have a remit to act in Scotland, although there are some transferability of findings. We did a lot of dissemination work through things like fishing news, adverts placed in MMO offices, and the fishing contacts that were on the project group. So Barry Dees at NFFO and Nathan and Tegan Moore did some of the communication as well. So we pushed out quite hard. We got about 92 responses, which for us in this sort of work is actually really good. We were very pleased with the response rate. Sorry, it didn't go north of the border.
Okay, that's no worries. And obviously you've included links if people want to read a bit more about the work itself. Next question asks from Laura, do you have any data that suggests what the impact of marine protected areas might be on making fishing sustainable for both seals and humans? In particular, do you have any higher resolution data around Lundy, since that's close to one of your main study areas?
There's a lot in that. Not all NPAs have seal features in them, and not all NPAs have static metrics in them. So in this particular case, we've got some challenges in putting them together. However, I don't feel that we want to be beholden to looking at this question within NPAs or outside of it. Actually, this is a problem regardless of whether there's an NPA or not. It may be that NPAs have sort of ecosystem enhancement functions which change the behavior of animals, maybe being more attractive. There's lots of subtleties in there which we don't have the resolution to deal with. So sadly, limited resolution.
Okay, no worries. Our next question asks actually about the device itself. The startle device, how was it triggered? Is it by a seal does it detect a seal nearby and then send out the sound, or is it just random, or is there a regular pace at how that startle emission happens?
Yeah, my understanding is that it's not triggered by seal presence. It's an ongoing deterrent. It triggers once every minute, but within that minute, I believe it's a random timing placement. So it's not a regular signal, it's a regular signal over a 1 minute period.
I might just have to turn off your camera, Chris, just because you're occasionally breaking up just with your audio. So don't worry, you're still going to be able to talk. It's just keeps crackling now and then, but we'll still work through our questions nonetheless. So just for the minute, the next question is from Lily, and they ask, there was a large jump in catch around day 30 on the testnet. Do you think that might have been contributing to the differences, as without the levels that would appear quite similar?
It's something that we explicitly looked at, so that was my first response and part of the justification in looking at outliers. We have an appendix in the report which does an outlier analysis, and it suggests that that particular outlier, that one outlier, isn't entirely responsible. So the level of 74% increase is actually relatively consistent. The next outlier, the second one is below, the third one might be above, and so without a really good justification for removing these outliers, no, it's not truly responsible for it. It does slightly change the significance if you remove that particular one, but then if you remove more, significance comes back in again. So what is the justification for removing the outlier? And given if you remove 2 or 3 outliers, the effect is significant again, and about the same size of 74%. We're happy that it's a robust conclusion.
Okay, our next question is from Anne. Do you have any information on the changes in abundance of mackerel in the area, more or less shoals, over the period that the trials were conducted?
No, in brief, sorry.
That's okay.
And probably not at the spatial resolution we need for any different, looking at any micro distribution or anything like that.
The next question also regards the startle device that you outlined, which was asking what is the kind of sound, I think this that is produced by the startle device. Yeah, what does it sound like to the seal? Is it actually recorded seal sound, or is it something that's completely man-made?
It's a completely man-made signal, as far as I'm aware. I would be out of my depth to tell you more than that.
Yeah, and again, the next question is about the pinger deterrent device. You said it's not readily available commercially yet, but is there at all a price that's associated with it? Yeah, that's a known.
I've asked specifically, and we haven't been given a commercial cost. In part, that might be because that's not the way that Genus Wave might want to market it. It might not be a single sort of sale of device. It might be something like a share of profits type arrangement, or any other process. It might be that they choose to develop the device in its early stages. So no, I can't give a commercial price. I wasn't when specifically asked. Okay.
Moving on to our next question from David. The plot that you showed of cumulative catch in trial and control nets is an unusual potentially confusing way for presenting the paired trial results. The cumulative diverges because 2 or 3 early trials and one around number 32 are higher than controls, but was there a pairwise comparison significant, i.e. did the devices produce a significant increase in catch? Is that
yes, so I answer that question. I could have presented it another way and perhaps that would have been better. There were pairwise comparisons, well, not a pairwise comparison made, but the GLMM did do that statistical comparison between treated and untreated, and it was found to be significant. So there was a statistical treatment effect, and I could have showed that a different way, let's say bar graphs of the two.
Okay. This next question is from Laura and goes back to the cost, which I know you said like we haven't got available to talk about so much, but do you think that it's likely that the cost of these devices could be subsidized by fishing agencies, or would fishermen have to cover these costs themselves for the device?
That's not something I can give a specific answer on. Some sorts of agency funding has been available in the past for some of these sorts of things, and there would be other potential avenues such as Marine Fisheries Fund that might be within scope for fishermen to purchase the devices. So at present and in the current state, no MMO or others aren't looking to put the money into the devices. I think we're probably a year away from this sort of discussion yet.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks, did you test the device on any other gear types, including gill nets or any others that were set deeper, such as more than 50 meters with a longer soaking time, such as several days?
No, is the answer. A constraint of funding, primarily. We would like to do more, but there are several constraints. First of all, the depth rating of the device would challenge to be set at 50 meters at the moment. So there are some logistical and technological challenges to overcome. We chose not to do several days soaks because of replication and the risk of loss of equipment. So, for example, if we were looking at longer soaks, we might be getting into putting, radar reflectors or AIS tags onto the equipment to protect it. It is a long-term ambition. I think the role of MMO in this will be to facilitate others to do some more of this work, or to support others in doing it through a letter of support and so on. I think at this stage, we are comfortable that we can't do much more until technology progresses and understanding improves.
I'm just noting the time for our attendees. Chris and I are going to continue working through the questions that we haven't answered yet. But if any of our attendees have to whiz off for any reasons, just please bear in mind that this talk is being recorded and will be accessible on our MASTS YouTube page. So if you've submitted a question and you haven't heard the answer to it yet, and you want to know what we say, please just tune into our MASTS YouTube page later and you can see it there later today, hopefully. And yeah, we'll just move on to our next question, if that's all right, Chris. We'll just continue working through these, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Great. The next question asks about the actual behavior of the seals. Were there any observations that were made when the devices were being used and when they weren't being used, when they were actually in the water, yeah, from your trials?
We have no underwater observations. The logistics of doing that and the time constraints of the project didn't allow it. It was something we would be, would have been interested in seeing how they responded to the nets, how they responded to the pings. And sadly, I just can't do everything.
Okay. So do you, I think this relates to a previous question that we've had. Yeah, Andrew, do you foresee any support for fishers purchasing these devices, or are the costs going to be borne by the fishers? I think, as you said, it's a bit too early to say at this moment in time.
Yes, that's right. So, and that depends how Genus Wave might be interesting going forward, or indeed whether there's any other market competition that might be considered and future policy. So there's a lot tied up in that, which is probably a year or so down the horizon yet.
Mm-hmm. And from Charlotte, they ask, how long was the study actually conducted for that you discussed? Is there any further work planned to look at the long-term effectiveness of these devices for fisheries, and potentially if there's any habituation by the seals to the device in the first place?
Okay, so the fishing trials were conducted over a fishing season of about 7 months. So with 36 falls, we've got about 36 days worth of data. There currently is no further work planned to do more trialing from MMO, but we are keeping an eye out to see what the developers do. For example, I know Genus Wave have been working with salmon farms, for example, and we'll see where some of that goes. I believe the startle reflex is not something that can become habituated to the long term. I think that's in the nature of its startle reflex. It's not possible to have a potential for habituation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Next question from Alex asks, if predation rate was unchanged by the treatment, the device treatment, except increased when seal scarer is malfunctioning, doesn't that suggest the device was working as a dinner bell? Any evidence of this on or nearby control nets?
Right. The catches were higher in protected nets. So what that suggests is that when protection is there, it's effective. I don't believe it can act as a dinner bell. I'm still trying to disentangle the reason behind those observations at the very last slide on the deprivation rate being similar between control and test nets when the devices were in there. I'm not sure I've got a satisfactory conclusion for that one yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. David asks, does the 1 kilohertz cause any effect in the mackerel shoal, if you're able to find that information, and at what kilohertz can the mackerel actually hear?
Okay, so I haven't got mackerel hearing thresholds to hand, but many of the fishes hear at a lower frequency than the ASD operates at. So you have got a sort of a species separation. Mackerel don't have a swim bladder, which makes them less sensitive to some of the acoustic properties of sound and more in relation to perhaps particle motion. So it's a slightly different process of hearing for mackerel than it would be for, say, herring, which were presented in the slide.
Mm-hmm. The next question kind of goes back to potentially the devices malfunctioning. The person asks, do you have any more information on what the malfunctioning devices were actually doing? This might actually be in one of the reports that you outline as well.
Yes, so there is some more information in the reports on the malfunctioning. We believe that most of the malfunctioning caused suboptimal protection rather than dinner bell effects. So it was a lack of protection rather than an attraction, we think, is where malfunctioning has impacted. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The next question was from Laura, and that kind of is very similar to a question that we've already had, and you've already answered. They asked, did you take any videos of the recordings of the seals responding to the noise? But as you've already outlined, there were no underwater evidence of how the seals were reacting was gathered. But do you have any information on what the startle response that you describe actually is?
So that's where I would refer you to the background work and evidence produced by Thomas and others at SMRU. He has showed us in the past the startle reflex captured on video while in the experimental pools at the SMRU facilities. So there isn't a body of evidence underpinning the neuroscience and behavior associated with the startle reflex.
Okay, we only have one more question to go through, Chris, but if any of our remaining attendees who are still with us right now have a question that they would like to submit, please do so now. Just use the Q&A box or the chat that's on the YouTube page if you're watching through there. And our last question so far is, do you hope that a similar device could be developed that could be attached to towed fishing gear in the future, or is this potentially just practically unfeasible until further devices are developed?
I think because tow gears experienced lower reported interactions and lower spatial overlaps with seals, the need for protecting a towed gear against seal interaction is substantially less. That would make it not really proportionate to try and tackle the problem in that way. But we are interested in how it translates to other gears, particularly, for example, long lining, where you might have the device suspended under the boat while hand lining is occurring, because there is some reports from fishermen that seal interactions, they pull on the line, and that has on occasion, led to hook embedding in fishermen's hands and things like that. So there is a safety potential looking at it for other gears, but not specifically for towed gears. I think that would be disproportionate.
Right, thank you. We didn't get any other questions submitted during that final one. So that leaves me to say thank you very much, Chris, for being today's MASTS webinar presenter. Obviously, the email for anyone who has any other questions that they would like to ask directly to you is up on the screen. And if any of our attendees want to rewatch any parts of this talk or actually click on those links, this will all be on YouTube along with those report links seen on your screen, so you can go through there. And thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
I would just like to outline to all our remaining attendees, we obviously have other talks coming up and they are free for anyone to join in. So if any of these talks that we have coming up interest you, please just register on the link that you did to attend this event. If you would like to also present, please get in contact with us with the email that's on the screen on the right hand side. We are looking for a speaker on the 29th of July and all slots in August are free as well. So just be free at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday and that would be great. Yep, thank you very much again, Chris, and thank you for everyone who has stuck around for our Q&A session. So we hope to see you at any of our future events.